So pretty much any time I make a video, there's almost always at least some stuff that I have to omit, whether just for the sake of time or because I can't find a way to include it in a way that feels natural or that flows nicely. So something I thought I might do for this second channel is bonus videos to go along with the videos on the main channel that go over some of the stuff that didn't make it into the main video. And in that sense, it's actually quite fitting that we start with a Sāhrok video, because by the very nature of how that video is presented, there's necessarily a lot of stuff I had to leave out. But we'll get to that in due course. So first of all, we might as well start from the very beginning. So I mentioned in the last Q&A I did that one of the original points of inspiration for the Refugium was that I really wanted to make a world that felt fundamentally and distinctly different from all of the stock standard cliché fantasy worlds that I'd been seeing at the time, because I was just really sick of worlds that recycled the same medieval European fantasy tropes again and again and again. Now, this was way back in 2013, so my sentiments about what I prefer in world building have changed a lot since then. Like, I'm still attracted to the idea of exploring new ideas and creating worlds and cultures with their own unique identity, rather than basing them off of something else that already exists, but I can still see the appeal of classic fantasy. But as part of this desire to make the Refugium feel different from other worlds, one of the points that I was really dead set on from the very beginning was that there would be no dragons of any kind or in any capacity. Not even in the context of mythology or fiction within the fiction, no references to dragons at all. Because this, I think, forms what might be one of my hottest takes when it comes to fantasy. I do think that dragons are ever so slightly overrated, or at the very least overused. Now trust me, I get the appeal, I really do. I do think that dragons in concept are very cool. But it feels like anytime there's any opportunity for any sort of monster in a fantasy story, 99 times out of 100 it's going to be a dragon. Which is exacerbated by the fact that in this day and age, the concept of what a dragon is has been really rigidly defined. It just feels like there's really not that much variation in the design anymore. Back in the day, dragon was just a generic term that could just mean any kind of vaguely reptilian monster, and we'll touch back on that in a little bit. But these days it feels like, other than the question of whether dragons have 2 pairs of walking legs or 1, and are therefore wyverns, there's really not that much variation in the potential design of a dragon. And at some point it just does feel like we're recycling the same design over and over and over again. And I don't know, I personally would prefer a little bit more variety in my fantasy monster designs. Which, by the way, this has nothing to do with anything, but I very often hear people referring to dragons as lizards in common parlance, but looking at some of the common depictions of them, I would say that they more closely resemble archosaurs than squamates, but that's neither here nor there. So that was kind of my mindset going into designing the Sāhrok, because even though I knew I didn't want there to be dragons, I did like the idea of having some sort of iconic mythical creature that filled a similar sort of cultural space to the dragon, while bearing as little resemblance to a dragon as possible. And it turns out that's actually much easier said than done. Again, partially because of the fact that the term dragon, in its original sense, is an extremely vague term, which is how you end up with completely unrelated mythical creatures from all across the world and all these different unrelated cultures, all being described as dragons, because the term dragon is loose enough to encapsulate all of them. So I wanted to do a similar thing with the Sāhrok, where the Sāhrok is not one specific creature, it's more of a general archetype of creature. Jackson Crawford sometimes talks about this on his channel on Norse language and myth, where a lot of these terms for types of creatures that we're very used to in modern fantasy as having very rigid definitions, things like elf and dwarf and troll and giant, a lot of them are really loosely defined, and sometimes not even defined at all in the older sources. Like, the only thing we can really say about what an elf is in Norse myth is a good thing that is not a god. and a troll is an evil thing that is not a god. So for the Sāhrok, I had to try and come up with a design that was both distinctive and recognizable, and had some particular defining features to it that at the same time was general enough to be extrapolated to other unrelated mythical creatures, so they could all be discussed under the same sort of umbrella term. So I quickly decided that the best way to go would probably be to make it an animal hybrid, which, are extremely common across lots of different mythologies. You got the Chimera, the Manticore, the Qilin, the Mushusu from Sumerian mythology. It's just a very common and natural idea to combine different animal characteristics into one single being. And something that actually turned out to be a sort of happy accident that helped the Sāhrok not overly resemble a dragon is the fact that one of the real-world animals that's very often associated with dragons is snakes. Words like worm can be used to describe snakes or dragons. A lot of early depictions of dragons don't have legs and are much more obviously snake-like, which kind of makes sense because snakes are really quite maligned animals in quite a lot of cultures, but one of the gimmicks of the refugium is that it has a slightly different biosphere from modern Earth, and a lot of the types of animals that we're familiar with in the real world don't exist in the refugium, and oddly enough, one of them is snakes. There are no snakes in the refugium. There are several different kinds of serpentine animals, but there are no snakes as they would be recognized or understood in the real world. And so I thought, if snakes are out of the picture, then what's another type of animal that would be maligned and associated with evil, or just generally monstrousness? And I thought a pretty safe pick for that would be some kind of large predator, in the same way that wolves have historically been maligned in quite a few European cultures. So I thought the equivalent of a wolf, which would be a creodont of some sort, would be a pretty good pick. And after that, it was just a matter of finding different animalistic traits that I liked and just cobbling them on top of a sort of creodont-like form. And again, the concept of an animal hybrid mythological creature is common enough that it's not too surprising that the Okolio and various other cultures had their own mythical hybrids, which, when the Thracians first encountered the idea, they could fit this in with their conception of what a Sāhrok is. And although I wanted the different versions of the Sāhrok from all these different cultures to be similar enough to each other to all be grouped into the same sort of category, I did want them to each be treated and viewed very differently by their respective cultures. So for the Okolio, a lot of their folk stories concern different animals, and each of the animals has their own virtues and character flaws. And the Khazwai is the king of the animals and shares in the strengths of all the other animals. It sort of has the best traits from all of them. Whereas the original Thracian conception of a Sāhrok is much more in line with just a scary monster for brave heroes to slay and overcome. While in Tsanur, the concept of the Karhumul has become a much more sort of demonic figure. It's more than just a type of animal out there in the wilderness. It is an actual embodiment of evil and destruction. And then for the Shi'ugorji, that one was pretty much directly based on the concept of a sea serpent, except in a world where serpents, as we would recognize them, don't exist. So it's somewhere between a sea serpent and a seal, like a mammalian sea serpent. Because obviously legends of sea monsters and lake monsters are just extremely common across human cultures, so it's not surprising at all that the Nhlokwa would have their own. And then in terms of the creation story of the Sāhrok, at least as it's told in Thracia, where the Sāhroks are some of the offspring of Thontoricum, this divine beast, who dwells in what is very loosely the equivalent of the underworld, in the sense that it's a dark, evil, scary place where all of the bad things come from. And the idea for Kothkilon, the Thracian's conception of this evil place, was informed by the cosmology of the refugium, because obviously a lot of real-world cultures have conceptions of an underworld that is quite literally underground. because it kind of makes sense to imagine some sort of scary place under the earth. Caves are pretty dark and scary, and it's pretty easy to imagine that they lead to some other evil sort of realm. Like in Greece, there are several real-world caves and other such places that were thought to be actual entrances to Hades, to the underworld. So it's not surprising that lots of different cultures have had these same sorts of ideas. But in the Refugium, you have the Nightlands, and anyone who's been to the mountains and looked over the edge to see the wall of darkness beyond, I think it would be pretty natural for them to assume that that is the evil, scary place where all the bad things live, and that would become their conception of hell, or the equivalent. So Korthkilon isn't an underground place, it's a place that's out there in the shadows beyond the mountains. Whereas Kugoskol, which is the Tsanurian equivalent of the same idea, and probably inherited from the same mythological basis, since the Thracians and the Empire of the Sun have a common ancestry and a common cultural background, but to the people of Tsanur who live right in the middle of the world, underneath the sun, they're not even necessarily going to know that the Nightlands exists, because they're too far away from the edge of the world. Whereas they live in a much more mountainous, craggy kind of area. Their civilization surrounds the sacred plateau of the sun, so in their case it would make sense to assume that the dark, evil, scary place is in fact underground. So Kugoskol would be more in line with the typical conception of an underworld. Now, when it came to actually making the video itself, this was my first ever attempt at diegetic world building, as presenting it as though it was written by an in-world character. Like, conceivably, if you were in the Refugium, you could go to a library and find this text and read it yourself. I've always wanted to try doing diegetic world building. I'd never gotten around to it before this point. It was largely inspired by Bill McGrath's work that he presents on the Artifexian podcast. Every month he presents some diegetic piece that he's done for his own world, usually in the form of a letter or a bulletin or something along those lines. And I really like the style and flavor and the immersion of that, so I wanted to try my hand at doing something similar. And it came with some unexpected challenges that I did not fully appreciate before I started. First of all, and I think most obviously, if all of the information in the video is presented from the perspective of a character in the world, then obviously the information is going to be limited to what that character knows or would reasonably have access to. So in this case, because it's being presented by a Nakashti scholar, this scholar is going to be very familiar with Thracian culture and mythology, but the further away from Thracia you go, the less reliable the information is going to be. At the time this piece is written, the Thracians are aware of the existence of Okolam, but they barely know anything about it. So it's very tricky finding a balance between being immersive and being true to the perspective of this character, while at the same time actually presenting information that is true and accurate and informative. Because, the scholar who is presenting this information thinks that Sāhroks are real animals, and is presenting this as if it's some sort of zoology article about the Sāhrok, whereas in fact the Sāhrok is just a mythical creature. It doesn't actually have any reality in the setting itself. So it's very tricky to know how to communicate that sort of thing properly. And in fact, as inspiration and as a sort of style guide for writing this one, I read through parts of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, where he's describing all these different types of animals from different parts of the known world. And there's some stuff that he gets quite accurate. There's some parts that he gets wrong, but you can kind of see how he came to the conclusion that he did. And then there's stuff that's just so completely off the wall and totally wrong that you have to wonder what he saw or what stories he heard that made him think that this was what was happening. And I was really struck by how confident he is in his assertions and how little he couches his assertions in speculation. He doesn't say, oh, according to some people, travelers and merchants have said that in India there are dragons. He just very confidently says, yes, there are in fact dragons in India, as if this is just mundane, casually verifiable common knowledge. So I tried to capture that same sort of vibe, but at the same time I didn't want to go too crazy, because this is already a fictional world, and my audience doesn't necessarily know how to distinguish the true stuff from the fake stuff. Like, if I had written that in Okolam there is a 3-headed flying hippo, then it would be kind of up to the audience to determine if this is just something that has been misinterpreted or just completely fabricated, or if, since this is a world of magic, this is something that actually exists. And to some extent, that is kind of fun to play around with it and to leave the audience to come up with their own interpretation of things. But at the same time, I prefer there to be some degree of consistency. So that was quite a tricky balancing act throughout the whole thing. And the other thing that I really struggled with was certain decisions to do with the localization, I guess? Because, like I said, this is supposed to be a text that is written by a Naqshti scholar, so the text itself would rightly be in Naqshti that I am quote-unquote translating into English for the benefit of the audience. But that came with a lot of instances where I wasn't really sure what the best way to translate things would be. Like, for example, anyone who's seen my Refugium videos will know who the Okalayo are. But Okalayo is the endonym. That's the term that the Okalayo use to refer to themselves. Whereas there's absolutely no way the Thoraians would call them the Okalayo. They would have their own exonym for them. So while I was writing the script, I had to decide, am I going to use the term Okalayo, because that's the term that my audience already knows? Or am I going to use the Naqshti exonym for it, because that's the term that this scholar would use? And I ultimately decided on the latter because it felt more immersive, and it helped to get across the limited perspective that the narrator has. Because the term that he uses, Iskalinan, doesn't specifically mean the Okalayo. It's more of a catch-all term that just means anyone who lives in or around the Indigo Sea. And that's another one, Indigo Sea. The Indigo Sea is just the name that I came up with for it, but each of the different cultures would have their own in-world name for the Indigo Sea. So do I just call it the Indigo Sea, or do I use the Naqshti term for it? And again, in the end I went with the Naqshti term Iskali, which is actually a borrowing from the Aedun word Zgalli, which means dark blue. And then the other big one was actually pluralization, because I obviously use quite a few Naqshti terms in this script, and there are several instances in which they need to be in the plural. And it was really hard to decide whether I should use the English plural or the Naqshti plural. Like, the correct Naqshti plural of Sāhrok is Sāhrokan, but ultimately I did decide to go with Sāhroks just for the sake of clarity. And at this point I'll give a shout out to my good friend Jake Penny, who is the co-host along with Miles Ronkovich of the Let's Have a Booba podcast, or live stream rather, where they do live conlanging every Tuesday, in the same sort of vein as David and Jesse Peterson on Langtime Studio, which I might as well give them a shout out too, because they also helped me with this. You can check out Langtime Studio on Thursdays at 10 p.m. GMT, where David and Jesse Peterson, who are some of the most prolific and successful conlangers alive today, live stream the creation of various conlangs for the board game that they're working on. So I recently got to meet up with David and Jesse and Jake, and I asked for their input on some of the things that I'd been struggling with while putting the script together. And they gave their thoughts and suggestions, and Jake especially was nice enough to look through the script for me and helped me with some of the decisions that I was struggling with. So do let me know what you think of this style of presentation and whether or not you want to see more of it, because I think it would be fun to do more videos in this style. And there are plenty more topics in the Refugium that I think this style would be quite apt for, like the Menaxe, which I mentioned briefly in this video, also called the Nalkrachtu in Aedun and the Achulcha in Okolawak. I finally got around to actually making a decent picture of them. This is the first ever drawing I've done exclusively using a tablet, by the way. I've never used a drawing tablet before this point. But the Nalkrachtu, or the Menaxe, or the Achulcha, or whatever you want to call them, they really do deserve their own video, which hopefully I'll get around to at some point. I'd also like to experiment with having multiple different narrators from different cultures to get different perspectives on the same thing. Like, how does the Empire of the Sun's perspective on the Nalkrachtu differ from the Okalaio's perspective on the Achulcha, for example? And having two different pieces, one written by someone in Tsanur and the other written by someone in Okalam, would just be a really fun way to highlight the cultural differences. So let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below, as well as any other questions or concerns you might have. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was very fun to make, and I will hopefully see you again soon for the next one.